Fantasy Animation is a completely free, online, educational resource dedicated to examining the relationship between fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. It is staffed by a volunteer army of academics and animators who give up their time to run the website so that our audience can be kept informed not just about the latest goings-on in the world of all things that are drawn, imagined and sculpted, but to help inform them about the historical, political, ethical and aesthetic ramifications of what it means to make an animated fantasy. Check out our weekly blog posts, containing insights on everything from the sexual identity of SpongeBob SquarePants to how to make an animation on a pair of knickers. You can also access our archive of podcasts featuring Oscar-winning VFX supervisors, historians, classicists, animators and folklorists discussing their favourite examples of fantasy animation. To find out more, visit us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Reddit at FanAnimResearch, FANANIM Research, or visit fantasy-animation.org. I hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome, listeners, to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So this episode marks yet another first for us as we look at one of the most important animation studios, certainly in Hollywood, of the last 20 years, Blue Sky. Now, as will become clear, I hope Blue Sky made significant contributions to the shape and direction of US animation, and particularly computer animation. They sort of came in under the radar. They were formed in February 1987 by animator Chris Wedge, and the studio recently hit the headlines as they unfortunately are now in the past tense. The Walt Disney Company acquired Blue Sky as part of their purchase in 2019 of 20th Century Fox, and then in February 2021 promptly announced that Blue Sky would be shut down as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, though we might debate that as part of our discussions over the next hour or so. Today's episode looks at Blue Sky's 2011 computer animated film Rio, directed by Carlos Saldanha, a colourful musical that tells the story of a blue macaw who is transported to Rio to mate with a female macaw named Jewel. Now, Rio is a film that I encountered during the course of my PhD and my subsequent book on computer animation, so I've got a few notes on sort of Blue Sky's role within Hollywood animation and its emergent studio system of the 2000s, anthropomorphism, obviously, a bit on narrative, and also the role of lighting, coincidentally, which again will become clear based on our guest. Alex convinced me that Anne Hathaway starring as a blue macaw in a fantastical version of Rio de Janeiro is a fantasy film.
I mean, you are hoist by your own petard. Do I need convincing? No, I mean, it's we can talk about anthropomorphism, we can talk about urban fantasies and constructing cities on screen and the fantastical and yet realistic way in which we the relationship we have with cities on screen. So I've got lots to say. And obviously I've got notes on lighting too, Chris. I wonder why that might be that we found that point of common synergy.
Yeah, it's weird that, isn't it? Yeah. So, in that, what is one of the worst and most awkward transitions we've ever done on the podcast, let me introduce our guest for this instalment, who is Michael Tanzillo, who has worked as a senior lighting technical director at Blue Sky on a number of computer animated films over the last sort of decade or so, including 3 of the Ice Age films, so Dawn of the Dinosaurs 2009, Continental Drift in 2012, and Collision Course in 2016. Today's film Rio, and its 2014 sequel, Peanuts movie Ferdinand, and then the recent Tom Holland-Will Smith feature, Spies in Disguise, from a couple of years ago. Michael's also taught the craft of 3D lighting to hundreds of students through his education company, which I know he's going to talk about, Academy of Animated Arts, an online academy teaching the artistic side of animation and VFX. And he's also, as if that wasn't enough, also an author, and is the author of Lighting for Animation, The Art of Visual Storytelling, which I think came out in 2016. So what better way to mark our first foray into the world of Blue Sky than with Michael? So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, guys.
I have lots to say and lots about lighting and Rio is something that as I was watching, I said to Alex before we came on, I really hope that Alex is enjoying this, because I've got no idea what he thinks of computer animated films as the fantasy guy, really. But it's an interesting yet entirely appropriate choice, I think. So alongside the Ice Age films, the two Rio features are among Blue Sky's, I think, most profitable franchises. And as a lighting director, I can totally see why the sumptuous imagery of Rio is such a rich film for us, I think, to talk about when it comes to kind of lighting techniques. But firstly, I just wondered if you could give listeners a sense of your sort of work in the lead up to Rio. You've been part of Ice Age: Dawn of the Dinosaurs, and then the spin-off short Scrat's Continental Crack-Up. So how did you kind of get to working at Blue Sky?
So I was an art student in the early 2000s here in the US, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was studying photography, I was doing some painting stuff and just kind of figuring things out. I picked up 3D software as I was working in an art gallery, because somebody submitted a proposal to the gallery as a 3D model of the space and put their artwork in there. And I was like, that's amazing. I was like, and they were a mediocre artist, but they got the show because they presented it really well. And I was like, hey, I'm a mediocre artist. I could use all the help I can get. So I started learning 3D. I worked with a former professor of mine who asked me to help do some 3D images for a book that he was working on. And then I just kind of liked the craft, and I didn't know what that meant until I saw Finding Nemo. It was the old version of Netflix that used to send you DVDs. I watched the movie, and it kind of like auto played into these after the special behind the scenes stuff. And it showed all these artists off the coast of Australia going scuba diving to help define the look of the film, to say that, out in open ocean, it's more crystal clear blue and it gets greener and murkier and creates more drama as you get closer to the shore. And my mind was blown. I was like, that is amazing. And so I immediately started applying because this was the first time I heard that lighting jobs existed. And so I started applying for them, grossly unqualified for all of them. And so I decided that I went back to graduate school at the Savannah College of Art and Design. I was only moderately more qualified for a job. I got a job as a render wrangler at Blue Sky out of school, which was not artistic. It was managing a series of computers to make sure they didn't turn off overnight, and optimizing renders and other. I loved it. I was in hog heaven. It was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. And then from there I started working my way into lighting reviews and doing practice stuff and demonstrating my skills. And then little by little, I worked my way up to a senior lighting artist there.
Terrific. So you were this was your first, when you got into Blue Sky, you were, as Chris said, working on the Ice Age franchises. Were those in slightly more junior roles, and then was this a sort of step up with Rio and Rio?
Yeah. So the Ice Age 3 is when I transitioned from being a more technical role on the film, the render wrangling stuff, to where I started lighting my first shots. That was in Ice Age 3, and then Rio, I think it was the first Rio, was my first head first dive. I ended up lighting and compositing it was over 100 shots in that film. So that was my first completely engrossed experience in lighting a project.
So as it's my job on these sort of episodes to speak for the perhaps technophobic listeners, to address the blue macaw in the room, how does one light an animation when surely there's nothing to light, right? Talk to us about. That's a
great question. Yeah. So the role of the lighting artist on an animated film is you ingest the animated shot. So if you ever look at an animation demo reel, it's usually a lot of characters over great props, or it looks kind of flat and looks a little bit bland. That's because there's no lighting that's been done. So the way that it works is you get a shot that's already been animated. The material and shading artist has already made the shirt look like cloth, the skin look like skin, the glasses look like glass. Your job is to infuse the scene with mood and emotion. And I would say that lighting artists have three main tasks. One is we have to communicate the mood of the scene. We work with the director, the art director, to establish mood, to say this is very romantic, but the drama builds as the scene goes on. There'll be things like, this character is being chased at the beginning of this series of shots. So we need to create a lot of drama there, but they slip away from the villain, so we needed to calm down a little bit by the end. So, or it's like, basically it's establishing the mood in a visual way, because all artists on films are storytellers, and we all contribute to the final story in the end. Our job as lighting artists to contribute visually to help set the mood. We also do things like direct the viewer's eye. So macaws can be very small on screen at times. Some of the birds in the film were teeny tiny. So making sure that little yellow bird read over the green background and things like that. Making sure that we developed a color scheme and a value structure to allow the audience to look where they needed to look. And also, it's all a visual trick, right? Like anytime you watch a movie, you're either watching on a screen or a projection, but you're trying to visualize a three-dimensional world. So we also work really hard to create shaping, volume, weight. So those are the three things. You create mood, you direct the viewer's eye, and you sculpt the image visually to get the desired result and create a 3D world.
So it seems like lighting is one of those roles that it extends out into lots and lots of different areas and tries to kind of make, because I know with computer animated film production that shots are given over to animators, and you said that you take hold of particular shots, so there needs to be a sort of cohesiveness across a film that takes years and years and years to produce, but also a sequence that might be comprised of 4 or 5 different animators' contribution on top of everybody else and every other artist. So lighting is one of those things that has to try and move across the edits and move across the cuts in a way that allows the spectators to kind of marvel at the accuracy, the detail, the complexity of these sorts of fictional worlds, in ways that sort of smooth out some of the potential. This shot was animated 2 years before this one. There's a real kind of cohesiveness to what lighting has to achieve. Would that be fair, that lighting stretches across films like that?
Yeah. And one of the main challenges of lighting on a feature film. So, if you light on an individual shot for a personal project, that shot kind of lives in its own isolated little world.
Yeah.
On the feature film, you have to make sure that the way your shot look matches from shot to shot to shot to shot. And in the best example I can give of that is in Rio, there's the chase sequence through the alley.
Yeah.
And there's Blue and there's Jewel, who's the female, who's the Anne Hathaway. Mm-hmm. Character. Mm-hmm. And they are two different, like we intentionally made them slightly two different colors.
Yeah.
Blue is more royal blue and Jewel is more cyan, kind of like a lighter thing. And so we constantly were comparing shots to make sure that we knew who, because they're just screaming through the city, through this favela, and just slamming into walls and jumping off this and flying through that. And so we always made sure that the audience could tell which one was which to help orient them all the time. So you're constantly A/Bing between shots and playing shots in order, so that if one shot ends, because like they're going through a city where there's a bunch of pockets of light. And so if one shot ends with them in the light, they can't start the next shot in darkness. They have to start the next shot in light and then go to dark. You know what I mean? Like we have to make sure that all this lines up. And it's not just you. So these lighting sequences, the same way that 6 animators will work on a sequence. And by a sequence, I mean a series of shots that exist in one time in one place. So films are broken up into chunks of sequences. The way it works for lighting is the sequence is done kind of all at the same time, but by multiple artists. There's a lead who's in charge of it and helps establish the look and originally gets approval, but then a whole bunch of artists get assigned to that sequence, and you all have to work together to take what the lead has done, match to that, but make sure you match the looks to each other too, all again while creating mood and shaping and all that stuff. So it's a lot of moving pieces all at once.
I mean, I've got 500 questions for you about lighting and mood, and I suppose we should give a sort of 2-minute précis of what this kind of film is about, because I think the narrative of the film really, as I said in the introduction, kind of lends itself to exactly this sort of. There's something about computer animated films, I think, as a genre, I would argue, at least there is a generic quality to computer animated films that where light. Images or characters or objects have a kind of glowing incandescence that marks it out from perhaps slightly different kinds of animation, and I feel like this Rio is sort of, as I said in the intro, a kind of perfect example of it's a perfect setting, or it's a perfect culture, it's a perfect kind of national context with which to really expand and play with, and maybe even cheat real life light setups and to kind of really play with the expressive qualities of light. But I guess we should give a quick kind of, what is Rio about? What is the what is the kind of,
perhaps you could tell us how
narrative?
It was pitched to you, or what was the
So we, I mean, but as an artist, when you work on things, you like, you're working on them for a year or two, right? So you get them pretty early in development, even as a lighting artist. And what we were pitched with was this idea that it was kind of it was a little bit of a fish out of water type of a film. The director of the film is Brazilian. The big thing for him was more so than in any other film that I've ever worked on, the city of Rio de Janeiro and the culture of Brazil was a main character as much as anything else in this film. And that was something that he really wanted to put forward. I think at the time, no animated film had ever been set in a modern day South America. It was just like, he really wanted to tell this story. And the story that they came up with was there was an endangered species of bird called the blue macaw. And there was one that happened to be living a domesticated life in Minnesota as a pet for this bookstore owner named Linda. And what happened was, these researchers in Rio de Janeiro discovered that she had this bird. They had what they thought was the last female blue macaw. So they contact her and get her reluctantly to come down to Rio to get these two birds together to save the species. And the smugglers find out that this is happening and these birds have a lot of value. So they kidnap Blu and Jewel. Blu is, the bird from Minnesota. Jewel is the female from Brazil. Kidnap them, take them away, and then chases and hijinks through favelas of Rio de Janeiro, through Carnival, through the life of Rio de Janeiro.
That's perfect. Why can't we do it like that, Chris? We'd be much better.
I know.
That's perfect. And I think you set up perfectly we have the story that I'm sure has a familiarity with some computer animated features. We have fish out of water, journey narrative, all that kind of fun stuff that you would expect from a story like this. But the key thing that you also highlight there is that it all takes place, or at least a lot of it takes place, within the city of Rio, and how palatable the feeling of being in Rio is to the movie. And I was struck by that watching it earlier today. And it made me think about sort of three zones of the movie that sort of it takes place. There's the sort of early bit in Minnesota, where everything's cold and drab and it's blues and indoors indeed. Then we have the kind of indoors. Rio, it's carnival, street life, lots more kind of exteriors and lots more kind of night shots, and I'm sure there's fun things you can do with night shots in terms of lighting. And then there's the kind of the surrounding rainforest as well, right? Because there are scenes where they kind of go beyond the city walls and escape into sort of the wildlife beyond. So were you sort of thinking about that on the film in terms of how you light and how you make these three different atmospheres sing on the screen? Because it's so important to the theme, right? Because the theme is about this kind of bird that should be in Rio, but really is kind of feels like they want to be at home in Minnesota with a hot chocolate. Chocolate.
Yeah. And then like the snow stuff, we had that down. We did Ice Age. We did a couple Ice Ages.
Yeah, sure.
3 of them by then. Snow,
yes,
boom,
of course.
Nailed it.
Why
we had that one in the back pocket.
Yeah.
No, but and even within, and so there was that. There was the jungle stuff that we knew about because we'd just done Dawn of the Dinosaurs, which was kind of set in a heavy propagated jungle. So that we felt better about. I felt better about that. The real interesting one for us and the real challenge of this film was Rio de Janeiro itself. And that was, we spent a lot of time, a brilliant lighting artist I worked with named Ari Ross dove deep into the favelas. And because within the city, there are different sections that we go around. There's the favela section. There's the main city part. There's like the main row where Carnival happens, and all that stuff was kind of researched. But the favelas, we really dove into, and kind of like what the aesthetics of those were, like the blue barrels that are on top of, like the water barrels that are on top of the roofs, and the type of graffiti that was there. And we actually did all these tests to figure out how stylized we wanted to make the film. So it was like we did some tests where the things were like really heavy graffiti and really kind of photoreal and accurate, to totally whimsical and like curvy, Dr. Seuss style buildings and stuff. And we kind of picked, we would define the look in between those two and kind of narrow it in a little bit. The other big, actually, and this is the dumbest one, is some of the biggest look development things that we had to do was two big things. One was we'd never done a film with characters with clothing, like a lot of clothes before. So cloth was like a huge thing. So early on during the testing, our characters were just running around naked because we hadn't developed the cloth sim side of things yet. And then the other big one from our standpoint was how to deal with the two main human characters wore eyeglasses. Okay. And that was such a pain in the butt for us because you had to deal with the reflections and the refractions and like reading their eye through it and how much we wanted to see, how much warp we wanted. And like that was a big time consuming thing. So sometimes it's the big stuff. Sometimes it's like, how do you do Carnival, which is more crowds than we'd ever done before, more props than we'd ever done before, to something as small as like, how do we deal with Linda's eyeglasses?
Okay. I hadn't really thought about that kind of placing of Rio within Blue Sky, because I'm very interested in Blue Sky as a studio, and as I said in the introduction again, that is sort of, we now speak of Blue Sky in the past tense, which is kind of a shame when you look at the scope of the kinds of films that they produce. So Rio is their 6th feature film, and actually your point about dealing with things that you hadn't dealt before is absolutely borne out in the stuff that's come before. You had Snow Down because of 3 of the Ice Age movies, and then the other 2, Robots, is obviously a very particular kind of computer animated film. Where everything has a metallic sheen to it. Horton Hears a Who, so an adaptation of the Dr. Seuss story from 2008. That, I suppose, leans towards a very caricatured, as you mentioned, that sort of caricatured picture book style.
And anytime you deal with like a book franchise, like a Horton, you're dealing with the Seuss. You're like, it's in collaboration with the Seuss folks.
Right.
You're dealing in collaboration with the Schultz people, so which are all fine and good, but it's like, but your style needs to be, you need to work with them to make sure that you're staying on their brand too. So you don't get full
interesting. Creative. Okay, is that what, because of the they have to map it to previous illustrations and visual designs of the comics and things?
They just, they own the rights to all that, to their characters, to their stories. So like you work with them on that, like to make sure that you're. Like Charlie Brown in 3D space was weird at first, and it took us some time to get that to look the way that everyone was happy with. But yeah, so that was that, and that's kind of one of the things with Horton. But with Rio, everything was on the table because it was
Yeah. See, that I think is really interesting because. So where are we now? So 2011. So computer animated films are 15, 16 years old, and Alex and I were saying before we started that. Trying to think about where and how computer animated films have come on, or where they've gone in the 10 years since a film like Rio. And I hadn't really thought about the potential influence of a film like Rio on films like Coco or Encanto, on the way in which, or even The Book of Life, or films where there is something else going on aesthetically, or in a way that certain animators or studios are tapping into and discovering cultures. In the case of the directors, as you said, are really evidently a personal story where they're trying to make the city space a character in and of itself. I'm not going to credit Rio for this, but that's been the trend in films that we're recognizing that, that you can center a film around different cultures, different people and different races and ethnicities and backgrounds. And it's not like, who knew like people would be interested in those things, right? Like it's bananas. So but that was definitely part of that trend of highlighting a different culture. And then actually that cultural thing came to a head a couple times. Like there was one scene, if you guys have just watched it, there's a shot where, Linda just arrives in Rio. It's very different than Minnesota. It's Carnivals. People are dressed in bikinis and lots of glitter and like lots of this, and there's a woman who's crossing the street in front of their Jeep, and she's like, that must be one of the performers, and the guy's like, that's my dentist, and he's like, hi, Dr. so-and-so. And in the original we had her in like a very in a bikini, in a classic Carnival outfit, and then somebody somewhere changed, like some executive saw and was like, no, that's too risque, we need to put her in a one piece. And so they put her in a one piece, and the director didn't know that had happened and saw it. And he was like, the Brazilian director is like, she looks ridiculous. Nobody would wear that. Right. And so it like this kind of thing happened. And what ended up happening, the compromise. So if you guys watched it in the UK, I think the UK got the international one.
there's two versions of that shot. So in certain countries, you'll see her in a 2-piece bikini that's traditional to Carnival. In the U.S., in our conservative past ways, she's in a 1-piece, still glittery thing. Still a doctor, still amazing, but like like there are these cultural things that pop up that like even at that time there was some conflict. There's different regions get different versions of the product.
So to go back to the city itself, I mean that's a fascinating process to me then. So how did the director want, or were there any particular processes you were going through to try and render Rio on screen in a way that he felt was reflective of the city space? Because I'm sure you've got to think a little bit about, I mean, there must be software where you can literally build a sort of 3D Rio and things like that, which I'm sure to an extent you've done in certain bits of the film and things like that. I'd love to know more about that. But as you say, this isn't a photorealist movie, and you don't want Rio. You want a version of Rio that fits the kind of tone and style of this movie. So perhaps you could talk us through kind of that process a little bit.
Yeah, it's a lot of like small identifiable characteristics that are unique to that area that you would only know if you live there or were very familiar with it. Again, like the color of the water towers, the type of graffiti, where the graffiti is located at, a big one was like the mosaic tile walkways that are all around, like the specific patterns that those are, where those are located at. It was very much a lot of like, from what I remember, it was a lot of like people, like artists internally using these reference images and stuff that we found online, or we did send some of our art team down there to photograph and actually be in Carnival to like experience it, so that you could kind of and they would the director and others would constantly be like, okay, no, that's not how that would look. This would look more like that. So it was more representative of the small details of a space, because we all live somewhere and know the way it looks at night, know the way that the light hits it during the daytime, and helps us find those nuances to really make it real for we were striving to really make it real for the people that live there.
So what do you do with those references as an artist? I mean, to ask a bunch of stupid questions, do you just use them as while you're programming and have them as sort of a visual reference? Do you scan them in and play with them with some software? What
you use them as a visual reference, and then you kind of pull attributes from those like visually into your design. So like if a good example is like the mosaic tiles, right? Like there are lots of photographs online. You can search right now for mosaic tile sidewalks in Rio, and you can find a whole bunch of them. And what we do is you kind of assemble, like there's like a gathering phase where you gather up as many of them as you want. Then you analyze them and you kind of pinpoint the ones that you want that meet your style within the film. And then as long as it's not like an identifiable place that has a very specific pattern, you can kind of play with it a little bit. So it's identifying the characteristics. Like the tiles are almost always black and white, right? Like, so black and white tiles that have these very kind of wavy, organic, but also like repeatable shapes in them too. It's like, okay, so then we can kind of go off of that. And then a lot of them too was like the design of the vehicles too was a big thing. So it was like the types of cars that are in Rio, and then we kind of like overdid those. They made them a little more boxy and squished and small and things like that. So there was so when you get the reference, it's literally just a visual cue in your design process, because everything that's designed, it goes through drawing. Like people draw it first. Like we have designers who like on Wacom's or on pen and paper or whatever they do, they will draw out, and they're set designers and they're character designers, and everything's done on paper in 2D form before we start building in 3D.
And would that be true of the lighting? Did you come to some sort of consensus as what Rio lighting looks like, or was it a sequence by sequence?
Yeah, no. The way that works is they develop what's called a color script for the film, or color key for each sequence, and that the art director or one of the art department artists will actually take the scene and they give you what we call paint over. So it's like the light's coming in from this way. These are the dark sections. These are the light sections. This is roughly what the color scheme is for it. And then we take those paintings and then we translate them into the computer as well. So it's a lot of like, the director, the art director, the artists, lighters will all kind of like, they start to build it. We collaborate on what that means and what their visual goals were. And then once we pull that into the computer, we base all of our stuff off of that, and then we try and add to whatever their goal was. So because some people will see that and be like, oh, they just give you paintings of what they want and you just do it. And you're like, yes, that is the start of it. But we really work with them to kind of make sure that we understand the vision that they had and the aesthetic goal, and we help plus that.
Okay. I suppose jumping off of that, I had a question about the role of the sort of studio authorship, because, you know, Blue Sky, amid a sort of 90s tussle for computer animated film supremacy between Pixar and DreamWorks at that time, and Disney would join the fray. You know, Blue Sky are really important because they sort of come in under the radar a little bit, but they are part of, I think, a sort of contemporary iteration of a classical studio system where you have, and I think your career perhaps bears this out a little bit, that you have sort of close creative and perhaps long-term relationships within studios, lack of migration between studios, kind of relatively loyal and stable workforce, and also creative figures that have become synonymous with computer animated film production, like Chris Wedge and Carlos Saldanha at Blue Sky. So I've always been interested in the sort of the way in which the contemporary Hollywood animation industry has been structured in a kind of classical way, that you have your Blue Sky and you have your DreamWorks and you have your Pixar and you have your Disney, and then you have sort of Illumination, Sony and Illumination, and I just wondered, are you if you're coming to Blue Sky, I suppose after they've done 2 or 3 films and you're sort of entering into a studio, are you, because I've always thought, you know, this idea of studios having a particular kind of aesthetic identity or tonal identity, and I feel like, you know, we know a Pixar film from a DreamWorks film, and a lot of the relationship between the two is often founded on DreamWorks established a tone, Pixar established the look of computer animated films, and those two things together have really set off what computer animated films look and feel like moving forward. Were you, before you joined Blue Sky, were you sort of, one, obviously aware of them, but more importantly, is the sort of, was there a sense of a studio style that you're also having to negotiate as part of we wouldn't do this in a Blue Sky film, or this feels more DreamWorks? I never really thought about it in that way, when you have animators who are kind of coming, and as you mentioned earlier, you have your Peanuts and your Horton, and you also and you're trying to navigate computer animated films whilst thinking about character design and what Peanuts looks like, or what Horton looks like. But did you have a sense of a Blue Sky identity that you were also having to wrestle with or adhere to, or a template for those kinds or their kind of movies?
The one thing, for a history, Blue Sky had been around since like 1990, I think. I don't quote me on that age, but it was just founded by like 6 people who, like, one of them being Chris Wedge. And like, this is literally the smallest thing. Like, Chris Wedge originally like animated on Tron. Met a guy named, you know, Carl Ludwig, who was our main, the guy who wrote like the renderer who rendered all of our films. And Chris Wedge, who is like the creative director, he was the director of the original Ice Age. He's the voice of Scrat. He is just an incredible. Both those guys are just incredible human beings to work with, and they were phenomenal. But yeah, when you come to Blue Sky, one of the things that I thought that, you know, that Blue Sky didn't do as well as Pixar or Disney was establish a brand identity. Like, the way that Pixar has a Pixar movie, and you know you're going to cry somewhere during it. You know that like a DreamWorks movie is going to be like blah, 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 like it's going to be kind of crazy, like whatever. But they have very distinct styles. Blue Sky never established that early on, and we were at the end. I was excited because what was happening was that Pixar was getting pigeonholed into making Pixar movies, and Disney couldn't do certain projects. And Blue Sky had gotten by on being fiscally responsible by making money, by making movies at half the budget that Pixar movies were, by having by like a smaller team that was tighter and closer. And we were the only studio on the East Coast of the US like, you talk about the loyalty, a lot of that is because people just have family on the East Coast and they want to live out here. I love living in New York. Like, that was why I stayed at Blue Sky for so long. It was, you know, partially the project, but also just sheer geography of it. And so what ended up happening was, towards the end, the film that we were working on, that it was announced, it was called Nimona, was stylistically different than anything that we had done before. It was tonally different than when we like a tone that was darker and more like tougher. And it was about its undercurrent. It was about a transgender character. and it was about like topics that Disney and Pixar couldn't really dive into. Unfortunately, we were unable to make that come to fruition. But we were about to do this thing that I was really excited about, which was not be loyal to the look of a film and not a style of a studio. In which case we were building a pipeline that was versatile, so we could do Spider-Verse style looking things, we could do hyper real looking things, we could do, and that was going to be the fun part as an artist, was just like, because you could just dive into different styles, and it's certainly not it's never boring to work on these films, but if you're doing the same thing stylistically film after film after film, it doesn't, you find that you get into like little bits of ruts.
Yeah, it must be tough though, because what it sounds like is that almost part of building an animation studio is building up your arsenal of things you've got. As you said, now we can do snow now, we can do, and so with each film you're building your storytelling arsenal. And so if you start from scratch with each movie, you're losing. Not that I'm sure it's quite so clear cut as that, but
the technology does carry over, and the knowledge does carry over. Like I always laugh at. So Disney Animation did a brilliant job in Moana with the water, and the water looks beautiful. And so like every film after that, they just like happen to be by an ocean and have this beautiful water floating around in every film. I always laugh about that. But like a lots of times too, studios, like that's the whole reason why studios do shorts too, is to test technology. Like Piper is one of my all-time favorite ones by Pixar. It was to test that sand technology that was so rad. It looked so good. And then it came up again in Luca. Like you test this stuff and then you kind of have it in your arsenal. Yeah. But and you're able to, you pull from that library, right?
But I was going to say, it's not just shorts, because I suppose one of the things I've been interested in Pixar's relationship to advertising and the way in which they used for a period at least, when they weren't making shorts. It was actually their commercial work and their sort of for hire business, if you like, that kept them over alongside kind of software sales. And it feels like Blue Sky had a similar sort of relationship. So am I right in thinking there was their own trademark software CGI studio? They sort of experimented with ray tracing, photorealism across over 200 television commercials. And Susan Omer's written a couple of pieces for the Society of Animation Studies blog, which talks about their work for Chrysler, M&M's, Texaco Braun, Bell Atlantic, and the sort of dramatic everyday where they're rendering sort of a close-up of coffee beans that personify and jump around, or a sort of, I think she talks specifically about a 1992 advertisement for a Braun Flex Control razor that was convincingly rendered the density, transparency, and reflectivity within the kind of reconstruction of the shaver's sleek metallic surface. So it is short, but it's also this important kind of commercial work, and it feels like so many studios, Blue Sky went through that process of using shorter formats, whether it's commercials or whether it's short films, Bunny, or as you say, these sorts of really shorter films where there's an experimental. That's not to discredit what these films are for or what they're doing. They're not just experiments with certain technology, but they often function as really important spaces where even creatives can try their hand at a short film before they maybe move on to a feature-length film. And it seems like it's not that Blue Sky have been written out of the history of computer animation, but because they haven't had that, they're not Pixar and they're not Disney and they're not DreamWorks. I mean, they're very successful in and of themselves, but their history, they do sort of similar things in their feature films. And now that we're sort of at the end of Blue Sky, if you like, this body of 13 features is a really, really important block of movies where computer animated aesthetics went in lots and lots of different directions, and they are the closest to a film like Spider-Verse, really, if you think about the different kinds of things that they've done across those 13 feature films. No, it just kind of struck me, their role within contemporary Hollywood is really important and striking, and perhaps isn't really thought about in the way that other studios might be.
It's interesting now that we're almost a year out from the closing to look back on it and think of what Blue Sky's place in the history of animation is. But yeah, it definitely doesn't get the credit. I mean, like when I think it was when Monsters University came out, there was all these articles about how that was the first fully ray traced animated film of all time, and we have Blue Sky going like, that's absolutely not true. We've been doing this. They've been doing fully ray traced stuff since 1992. Like, what are you talking about? Yeah. And so you were talking about the commercial work in the 90s. Yeah, like that. I mean, so they were building this render, right? And it was really all about making like the best images. And then like their bread and butter, how they made money was doing these commercial projects. And I really do think that the commercials were in the films. They did like, was it the talking fish from The Sopranos and Joe's Apartment, the cockroach movie, and some other stuff too. And all that was to, I in my head, they were just funding this really cool project of making CG images, and it was just like whatever they could do to test it and make money. And then that led to Bunny, which was the animated short that won an Academy Award, and it was great. And it was through that, and then it was like after Toy Story, the big companies started being like, oh, this feature 3D animation could be a real thing. And so that's when 20th Century Fox approached Blue Sky about purchasing them, and then because I don't know if and then they developed Ice Age and released Ice Age in collaboration with 20th Century Fox.
Yeah. Well, Fox we did a Don Bluth episode a couple of episodes ago, and I know that Fox had kind of already tried to break in to that at that point quite a lucrative animation market in the 90s. Headed by Bluth, so you have Anastasia, Titan AE, but really it's Fox's relationship and the sort of tectonic plates, to steal several jokes from one of the Ice Age movies. The Continental Drift, if you will, of the industry is such that you have studios and subsidiaries that then work with these bigger DreamWorks buying or working with PDI or Big Idea, and just sort of subsuming them into these big, so you have this again, you have these big voices within contemporary Hollywood, but then Blue Sky working with Fox, becoming a subsidiary of 20th Century Fox, then being purchased by Disney, and now being shut there. It's sort of a
just an interesting narrative, I think.
It's hard. Well, I gotta tell you, the hardest part right now is that Disney's coming out with some like Ice Age content on Disney Plus that we don't have anything to do with, and it's like it's so hard to watch. And I wasn't even there from the beginning. Like I think about Chris Wedge again, amazing dude who just like he invented these guys and then sold it to a company because that's what you had to do. You like because it costs $100 million to make these movies. We didn't have $100 million, right? Like or 60 million or whatever it was at the time. And so you have to partner with these big companies to get your vision made, and then they sell you, and then they sell you to someone else who arbitrarily shuts you down and then takes the thing that you made and makes a worse version of it. And it's really hard to wrap your head around that and to do that. But it's kind of like, it's just kind of the way it works, man. It sucks. But it's just kind of like when you say, it goes to show if kids at home, if you ever make something and sell it to another company, it's great. And you get a big chunk of change, but you lose the ability to keep it afloat and have control over what happens with it.
It'd be painful if we ever see Blue pop up at like Disney World or whatever.
They can do that. Right? Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean it's
the Carnival, the Carnival parade.
There will be one piece bikinis there. There will not be any pieces for the kids.
Yeah, depending on which Disneyland we're in.
Right. Paris, do whatever the hell you want.
To come back to, let's go back to Rio, because you mentioned that there'll be certain sequences that you were sort of tasked with as part of the role. Was that right? I understand that right. So there'll be certain moments in the movie that sort of
So as an artist, you're heavily invested in smaller chunks of the movie, and then there's literally some stuff I didn't see until the premiere.
So talk us through some of your moments. Then you mentioned one, which was the favela chase sequence, which I'm delighted to hear. Because it was one of the standout moments of the movie for me. I'm not just saying.
Yeah, that was a fun one. So the ones I spent the most amount of time on was the favela chase sequence. There was inside the smuggler's room when they're like when Blue's pretending to be dead. That was a really good one. There was a great back and forth. So there's them like. I was show as an example of them walking down the alley to get into the smuggler's room because it's the that was where we had the most like that was one of the moments where when an animator and a lighter were like these two ideas were diametrically opposed. So Blu and Jewel are trapped in a cage. That cage is covered by a heavy piece of fabric with a small hole cut out of it. It's nighttime. They're in a dark alley. There's no reason for there to be light in there. And so when the lighter first lit it, this amazing guy named Brian Dean, when he first lit it, it was like dark and moody, and there was just like a ray of light coming in through this hole, and you could just kind of see a little bit of them, and it looked super cool. But when we showed the director, they're like, but you can't see any of the performance that they animated.
Yeah.
And we're like, so?
Okay.
So what? The lighting looks amazing.
Yeah.
So when you look at so we had to find a look that worked for everybody. But if you look at that, there's 1,000 times more light than would ever get into a heavily cloth bird. Anyway, so there's that sequence. There's the chase sequence. I did some Carnival stuff at the end.
Okay.
There was I had this on my own. There's like a 3-shot. There's like a 3-shot sequence that was just like a cutaway of them, like a silhouette of the guy handing him the money against the plane, and the plane taking off, and like the smugglers are making the financial transaction part. I worked a little bit on the opening sequence, that song and dance number.
Yeah.
Which was that opening shot. The guy who sat across the hall from me, a guy named J.U., he always, we would call them the Widowmaker shots, because they're just like the ones that you see and you're just like, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? So it's literally like a little bird hops, and then there's the Rio logo, because it's the film title, and then the bird flies away and flies over these, and these other birds pop up, and like all these other crazy things happen. And he spent like months on that. So there were like in the rest of that sequence we helped. And the tough part of those is you have to do the title shot like 14 times, because there's every language you have to do it for. So there's like English and Portuguese and Mandarin and Japanese and like all these different ones. You have to do them over and over and over again. I mean, like you can render them once, but like compositing, you have to put in the different title cards all the time.
Can I come back to that example you gave of they're trapped under the, do you light it well, and the lighting is cool and realistic, but doesn't capture some of the stuff. So it's because it sounds like when you were listing those things that lighting brings to the movie, and they're things that, when we do kind of, film language, or, come on, how do we analyze a movie? It's things we're really keen to express. And for my film production students, I'm like, the one thing you're going to be doing is waiting around on set a lot for them to get the lighting right. So we may as well pay attention to it now we're watching the movie, right? So, but sounds like some of the stuff is adding weight and realism and a sense of believability to everything, because without the light it doesn't feel alive, right? But the other thing you're doing is you're stylizing it. You're kind of it's part of an almost illustrative process. So I guess with my fantasy hat on, part of what you're doing is making the thing more realistic, and part of the thing what you're doing is adding to the sense of imagination or sense of I don't know what the word is, speculation of it all. Like you're playing with the image as well, yeah.
Totally. Yeah. The way I always describe lighting on a film, because my actual degree is in photography, my undergrad.
Okay.
And they're like, oh, that must come in handy. And I was like, sure. But like lighting, because they assume lighting for a film is like photography or like lighting for a live action film. And it's not. It's much more like painting than it is, because you work off of the believability of light, right? Like you work off that a campfire lets off light that dies off after a certain point and all that. But you have total control over what it's doing. So like, as long as you don't break reality with the audience, you can pretty much do whatever the heck you want. And it's just, and then it's like to the point of telling the story. So like you'd be amazed what you can kind of get away with in believability to a point. And then it really does drop off a cliff. Like once you make something a little bit too bright, people are like, nope, that does not look right. But you do have leeway in believability. So it's, and that's the difference between lighting, because there's lighters who light for live action films to integrate Transformers into Los Angeles. And then there's lighting for an animated film, and lighting to integrate is all about making sure the shadows match, making sure the black points and the white points of the image match and all that stuff. Animation, it's much more about like the mood and the story and that kind of thing, because you have more flexibility and the realism of it.
Yeah, it sounds like it's more creative. Well, I don't know about creative because I want to do a disservice to the Transformers artists, but there's more room to think about doing things not because that's the way they have to be done, but because that's the way they want to be done. And
to be clear, the VFX lighters have an extremely difficult task with that. It's like that is an art form in itself. That's really cool.
Sure,
but it's just different. It's just a different mindset.
Yeah, you've got more I don't know, flexibility or whatever the right word is.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And then I have in terms of the lighting, it sounds like you might not have worked on these sequences, but I also noticed, talking of films that Rio sets up, and you mentioned Moana. We also have what's his name from Flight of the Conchords, Jermaine. Jermaine doing.
Oh my God, that guy is amazing.
And I noticed. So I did have a question about that. The way that character is lit.
Yeah.
And versus how other characters lit. So is there such a thing as villainous or heroic lighting? How does one make a character look bad and good from lighting?
I'll tell you the thing that was hard about that character is that he's a white feathered bird, and Snoopy, Ferdinand, any character that's either all white or all black is really, really hard because you kind of got to light them in a way that they don't get too bright, but then if it like falls off, it looks a little dingy. But we definitely hit up his villainous thing. His introduction shot when he's standing on the body of the security guard and the flashlight rolls underneath him and like shines up under him. I'm just going to keep one of my artist friends, Rosalinda, lit that, and she just did like an absolutely brilliant job with that one. So the villainous stuff is all about like underlighting. It's all about contrast, like increasing the contrast on it. It's all about just like heavy, like, and when I talk about contrast, it's not just light and dark values. It's like heavy contrast and color. Sure. And also it's a lot of sharp lines. It's a lot of small shapes. You learn that as a lighting artist, like larger, softer shapes create comfort in the audience, and smaller, tighter, like shadows that exist and like really kind of create a unease in them. Imbalance in the shot, like visual imbalance creates unease in the viewer as well. So it's like there's obviously the first thing you always think of is the underlight, is the flashlight under your chin to look spooky thing. But a lot of that is more saturated colors, sharper shapes, all that kind of stuff. Definitely villainous lighting. Although that guy is amazing. Some of the artists went down to Rio for the premiere, and he was there and just like partied with them and was just an absolutely lovely dude. He was like, it was funny because like, you know, Jamie Foxx is in the movie, Anne Hathaway, Jesse Eisenberg, and they're like walking the red carpet and everyone's like fawning over them. And like Jermaine just like walks in with the other artists, like, hey guys, like nobody really noticed him at all.
So I've sort of wanted to pick your brains a little bit about that compromise position that it seems like lighting directors or when it comes to lighting techniques, the compromise position that you have to occupy between stylization and realism. And it's interesting that one of the first, if not the first, fully fleshed computer animated character happens to be a lamp, i.e. And there's something in that with regards to the idea of what Luxo Jr. as a short film did, and also the sort of, I think there were some Sesame Street spin-offs featuring Luxo Jr. with regards, and they were called things like light and heavy and front and back and up and down, and they were like educational, like this is how we're supposed to understand computer animated world. This is how physics works, this is how light works, and I don't think it's any coincidence that Luxo Jr. is one of our first characters, because it emphasizes the importance of light to character and storytelling. And I've sort of embraced Luxo as a descriptor to talk about computer animated film worlds more generally, because I think, as I said, there is that sort of glowingness to computer animated films. But I was reminded, I think it was during the production of WALL-E, where they got Roger Deakins on board to talk about cinematography and lighting. And I think it's on, going back to your Finding Nemo kind of making of special feature thing that started off this journey for you. I think there's a special feature on the WALL-E DVD that's Roger Deakins talking about lighting, and he's talking in a room full of Pixar animators, and they've got their like notepads out and they're ready to write down whatever he says, and he gets someone to sit on a chair. And then he goes, right, we'll have this light and a key light and this light and a bounce light and this. And he says, this is how I was told to light it. And then he asks the audience whether they think it's successful. And they're like, yeah, it's not that interesting. It's fine. And he says, yeah, what's more interesting is that guy over there standing in the corner that's getting the benefit of refractions and light that's bouncing off of people in the room. And it's the sort of there's the realistic lighting, and then there's fantasy lighting, or there's lighting that at least is used to sort of cheat what we might understand as the realistic behavior of light. But at the same time, light is connected to enhanced visibility, which is presumably connected to appeal, and so you are always having to sit in between. It's not just it's not just characters or settings that are stylized or occupy a space between hyperrealism or photorealism and caricature. Lighting has to do interesting things all the time, because some scenes presumably do lend themselves to more realistic lighting, whereas other scenes, as the scene you described in the dark, you have to sort of navigate around the realism of the scene in order to sort of create meaning or to create drama, to go back to the point in terms of mood. Did you kind of feel that you are in this compromised position all the time? What's legible, what isn't? What's realistic, what isn't?
Yes. Yeah, all the time. And another big thing about animated films is that they have a target audience age, right? Like, and they're different. Like Rio, Spies in Disguise was older than Rio, which was older than Peanuts. And in Peanuts, we were very aware that it was a younger audience. So we're just trying not to scare the crap out of kids. Like that's so you're trying to create drama without just like making them lose it, because you also have to be aware of the medium in which it's being presented, which is a dark movie theater. And if you darken it even more, and then just kind of create, like you are creating a situation that can be, it's dramatic, but can be a little bit too much for your intended audience. But you are constantly, and every artist on a film is dealing with two contradictory things all the time, which is you are collaborative and you are working together for the good of the film, because that's what we're all there for. We're all there to meet the director's vision and make this thing as good as we can. There's also the arrogance of an artist, which is like, I want my thing to stand out, which is always like a thing that kind of comes through. And so like, and because you just want to do the best job that you can. And we always said this about, between animators, the effects artists who do the effect simulation, so dust explosion, they always want like their effects to stand out more. And you're like, no, it kind of needs to integrate more with the shot. And they're like, but then you can't see it. And you're like, but yes, but it needs to integrate. It was like an endless battle. And it's the same thing with lighting. The lighters always want to make things more dramatic, always want to like hit it harder with the like the Roger Deakins thing. We don't like, it's less interesting for us because that's kind of like the hero lighting, the 3-point lighting with the Rembrandt lighting and all that stuff. Like that's great. And it works out really well for movie posters and stuff. But in the film, like we would love to get that secondary light thing happening off of them. And you don't always, you get directed in a way that would indicate that they wanted it more like the hero lighting stuff too. So it is a constant push and pull. And each director, each art director is different. Each style is a little different. So you learn to work with, but then like, again, you push it, and then you always know that you're working with a specific style with an art director or director too. So you modify it to their liking as well. Yeah.
Mike, you've been very generous with your time, and it's been great to talk to you about Rio. Just before we say goodbye to you, do you want to just tell us about what you're up to now? I know you're involved in a project called the Academy of Animated Art. Perhaps for listeners who might be interested in that, you could tell us a little bit about that. Yeah, so if you're interested in a possible career in lighting on animated films, I started an online school with one of my co-founder, Jasmine Katatikarn, who we lit together on at Blue Sky Films for years. We were doing recruiting trips to colleges around the US, and we were discovering that there were a lot of people who were interested in lighting, but they weren't given the skills to create a demo reel that would put them in a position for a job. It was the same thing that I struggled with too, which is why I had to take a render wrangling job out of school. I couldn't get an artistic job. So what we did was we started an online school because what we were finding is that these students were just like their artwork wasn't up to speed, like they just didn't have it on their reel yet. And when we talked to them, they were so focused on the technology. Like, I just need to learn this software. I just need to learn this render. I just need to learn this. And here we came from a studio again. You talked about Wall-E. Wall-E is beautiful. It was done 15 years ago with technology and on hardware that is way outdated, but it looks amazing. The Blue Sky movies were done. The renderer that we used we didn't even have a GUI for it. There was no user interface for it. It was just like lines of code that we would type and then we'd render out an image. But it didn't matter, because you have artists who have craft and artistic knowledge to make beautiful images. So we decided to start an online school that really focused on training people's eye to see the world differently and to make beautiful images. So we have a series of classes that you can take online, pre-recorded lectures. Sign up for those. We also I do daily lighting critiques for the time being, and we provide daily professional feedback on your work, and which is a huge part of any artistic pursuit, because it doesn't matter. Anybody who's ever tried to learn how to draw or how to create something, you hit a wall where you can look at it, because your eye and your mind develops faster than your skill, and you can look at it and be like, this isn't good enough, and I don't know why.
and it's super frustrating. So we provide an outlet for you, post your work. I joke that I'm like Ron Burgundy with a teleprompter, put anything in front of me, I'll critique it. And, and so we really, really help our students. And in the time that we've had this program, we've had now over 300 or 400 students go through it. We've helped people get jobs all over the world. Our artists are now at, DreamWorks, Disney. We had two of our students get into the Disney apprenticeship program, which was really cool this year. We've got senior artists at Sony. Like I said, one of our first students was a senior lighter on Spider-Verse. And he was a guy that, and it's so many people with the same story. Like they're either in school or they just, they're working in another industry and it just doesn't feel right. And they want an opportunity to switch. And so we really focus in on giving you the training and the skills that you will specifically need to help get a job. Because for me, this industry has been life-changing. I can't imagine doing anything else. I was really, I was bartending in the evenings to make ends meet and trying to figure out my life in between. And if I hadn't found this, I don't know where I would have ended up. But it's creative. It's technically challenging. The people you work with are incredible. You get to work on really cool projects that you get your name in the credits. Like, let's not pretend like that's not cool. And it's great. It's all good.
And if listeners wanted to find that, where do they need to go? There's a website, right? There's
Oh yes, sorry, I should say more things. www.academyofanimatedart.com.
Terrific.
Hopefully, and then you can find the classes from there. Reach out to us. We'll happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Mike's been kind enough to write a blog post for us as well, where you can read some of his tips.
Yes.
And we'll put a link to the Academy in that as well, so people can find that either if you're listening right now or in the future. It'll be on it.
We will put a link into the blurb, and people can read as alongside listening to the podcast. They can sort of read your blog post and actually watch some of your work, and we'll obviously hyperlink to your online space as well. So thank you.
For more behind-the-scenes discussion, you can, of course, visit fantasy-animation.org. We have professional animators writing for us through blog posts, as well as contributing to various past episodes of the Fantasy Animation podcast. We've got VFX artists from Trickster talking about Captain Marvel. We've got John Musker and Ron Clements talking about writing and directing Treasure Planet.
And we've also had animators and VFX artists who worked on the twisty-turny television program Dark as well. So definitely check out those episodes.
Many more besides, I'm sure, all available on the archive, fantasy-animation.org. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at fananimresearch, FANANIM research. And it's the same if you want to send us an email, fananimresearch@gmail.com. Footnote episodes will be launching in the in-between weeks, so if you've got any questions you want us to solve in 10 minutes or less, we'll happily devote our time to it then. Keep them coming, and thank you for those who've sent them in so far. Otherwise, that's been us for another episode, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.